This is the Convene podcast. My name is Maggie, Digital Media Editor. In this episode, Daniel Hires explores the potential of the Inner Development Goals, a not-for-profit and open-source initiative which was first introduced at the conference in 2020. The idea behind came from the founders' realization that while in 2015 the Sustainable Development Goals gave us a comprehensive plan for a sustainable world by 2030, we seem to lack the inner capacity to deal with our increasingly complex environment and challenges. In November 2023, the IDG Foundation was initiated by 8 organizations, among them the Flourishing Network at Harvard University and World Business Council for Sustainable Development. The IDG's main focus is on working with organizations as they have a potential to accelerate human growth and collective learning. With Daniel, we discuss how inner growth drives systemic change, the importance of gratitude and self-reflection practices, and how organizations can empower employees to navigate complexity, foster collaboration, and align purpose with action. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to the Convene podcast. Today I'm joined by Daniel Hires, who is Executive Board of Directors, Marketing and Partnerships at the Inner Development Goals. So welcome, Daniel, to
Hi, Maggie.
the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's like we've shortened it a little bit, so it's more easy, I think. It's just like the Chief Marketing Officer, so it makes it a bit easier.
A CMO, everybody knows a CMO.
Exactly.
Yeah. I just want to start things off with your personal perspective. You've been working in the sustainability field, so how have your own views evolved with time, especially now that you've joined the Inner Development Goals?
All right, good. We have a first question that we can spend 2 hours on already. So, yeah, they've evolved greatly. I mean, I originally didn't necessarily grow up in a household that, was like super eco-fanatic or anything, but I did grow up in Europe. And when I went to study in the US, I noticed that there was a bit of a culture change that, my first weeks at university, there's welcome week, there's all these brunches, lunches, picnics, and there would just always be this mountain of plastic left over. And I just realized how, not being overly sensitive to it, coming from Europe to the US, there was a bit of like, yeah, wow, nobody is thinking about this at all. And so that, I think, was maybe the first kind of wave of my kind of sensibilization for sustainability. And then I studied in the US. I came back to Europe, to Germany, and I was working in the sustainability field, actually, where I was working in the carbon market back when nobody knew what carbon offsets were. We were, on the one hand, developing these projects, and on the other hand, selling them into, back then, the compliance markets. It wasn't even about like offsetting your own emissions. And then I was part of that kind of change to look into, so we had these B2B clients buying, 1 million tons at once. And I was part of more and more conversations around, the consumers are looking to also be more green. And that, I think, was then the next phase where we worked to see how can we then develop products, offerings to people to also have more green and sustainable lives. But I think the big change came a couple of years ago with really a sea change, I think, in how I look at the world as well. And I think this oftentimes comes with age, it comes with personal crises, like feeling burned out, maybe loss of meaning, some personal tragedies as well, where you really start to think a bit more about the big picture. And for me, that just included that I realized that if we as kind of impact entrepreneurs or social entrepreneurs, if we're just changing the what, and we put like now the impact in front of entrepreneurship and describe what we're doing, that's not enough. Like we actually need to change the how as well. Because if we're building the same types of organizations and structures that are burning out our staff and burning out ourselves, we're just contributing to burnout and the status quo. And so that's how I ended up understanding or getting a feeling, a sense for the inner dimension of change that we needed. And that's where I am currently, working with the inner development goals on really trying to give that change a language.
I love that. And there's so many things we really can be just circling that question, your answers. First of all, I have to speak on the carbon offsets.
Yeah.
Where do you stand currently? Because carbon offsets are not, let's put it, sexy anymore.
Yeah. The question is if they ever were, but there was a novelty factor, I think, for sure. I think that there are smart parts about thinking of a market-based mechanism of how we approach this. And I think there's a lot of parts that are difficult and flawed and kind of show us actually that the whole system in which this is embedded in is actually also part of the issue. And so it's, like always hard to say like black or white, is something good or bad. I think in the extremes, it's clear when it's like a scam offset, when it's an HFC 23 project, when it's, like things that really are just exploiting the logic for money. Obviously, that's not good. And on the other hand, there's cases where communities are actually getting real access to some finance to do some really good work. And that's wonderful. And now we could also talk about carbon removal credits and like, do we need any of those? And I think that's where I might be changing my mind, where I think I was a little bit more dogmatic when I was younger and thinking that this can't be part of the problem. This is still kind of embedded in this industrial logic. But now I think 20, 30 years later, I'm thinking more and more, does this buy us more time at least? And is this, even if it's an imperfect solution, is this something that, as much as it pains us, might help us?
Yeah, good way to put it. Because at the end of the day, we just have to make steps forward.
Yeah. I think the important part is that we understand that this is not the solution. This is just a crutch. This is just, like the spare wheel that we carry in the back of the car to get us to actually the place where we can get a real tire.
Yeah.
And I think the danger is that we forget that we say like, well, we're on the road again, we can go 100 maybe, we can't go 120, but at least we're driving. But I think it would be very short-sighted not to understand that these are solutions that are temporary and that if we want to look at the more long-term perspective, we also need to broaden our view.
And isn't there something with such crutches that they become comfortable? We get used to them.
We get used to everything.
Yeah, so and this idea of comfort, I believe, is what brought us here in that kind of stage that we are as, humanity in society with all the issues that we have. It was the constant chase of comfort.
Yeah.
And how can we avoid that?
Yes, a good question. I think we've built a system, right? You could argue that capitalism itself is built on this idea that, like we're not creating value, we're creating comfort for people. So it's a big question. I wish I had a better answer, but I think part of that is probably the search for meaning and the search really, we hear it a lot these days, like impact and purpose and meaning and all of these things. But I think if we really think about, like what is the context in which we embed our actions in, and that we really get to a point where, we are a bit more in touch with our humanity, I think that could be a start.
Yeah. And I just want, for those listening that don't know the work of the inner development goals, I just want to explain a little bit, and please help me here.
Sure.
The goal of the inner development goals is to give a framework to help companies and individuals reach the UN SDGs, right? The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, to make them a bit more tangible. That's at least how I
that's
understood.
A good way to put it. Yeah.
Would you add anything to that, or?
Yeah, so I think at the core of the IDGs is really this idea that if we want change in the world, whether it's sustainability, the SDGs, you want to talk about regeneration or a sustainability transformation, but even beyond that, a lot of the challenges that we face today, whether it is social and political or whether it is within our organizations, they're oftentimes not just complicated, they're actually complex. And that means that as organizations or people who are trying to change them, we need to understand what is our role in this change and how are we contributing, maybe unwillingly, to kind of maybe sabotage the change that actually we say that we want to try to enforce or try to develop. And so I think that is really the core message of the IDGs, that if we just look at the external part, we're missing half of the picture. And in order for us to have a conversation now to talk about this, that's why we developed the IDG framework, in order to have something that a little bit like the SDGs allows us now to talk about, well, I'm actually working on my inner compass. I'm not really sure where is my true north and, where are my values? And so I'm exploring that a bit more to be able to exchange with someone who says like, I really understand that, if I was just 10% more courageous, I could get a lot more done both within my organization, and then even we can take the organizational perspective and say, as an organization, if we were just able to be 5% better at collaboration, oh my God, we don't need to hire 5 more people. Like the existing team could actually take care of that.
So it gives me a sense that you're expanding beyond just sustainability, but it's more of better, more efficient operation in general.
Yeah,
be
indeed.
it in life or at work.
Yeah,
right?
indeed. So the idea or the motivation, I think, for the IDGs comes from this idea that sustainability is the biggest, most complex issue that we're facing in the world. But I think it's a nice side effect that if we are starting to equip ourselves to deal with complex issues like sustainability, a lot of the other things that are complex in our lives will be helped with that as well. So we'll be better equipped to deal with other changes and challenges that we face.
Yeah. I'm a huge fan of the idea that you can lead from any chair, meaning that you don't have to be in a leadership role to inspire
Absolutely.
change.
Yeah.
And this gives me the hope that that's a way to promote this whole idea of leading from any chair.
Yeah.
But how can companies, because I'm sure that people listening will be trying to put it into their perspective, into their own work and life, how can they take the IDGs? Can they take the IDGs? Is there a way for them to start implementing it tomorrow? What would that look like?
So I would not necessarily advocate that they have to implement the IDGs. I think we could start with the idea of understanding and valuing what inner development has to offer for us. And so I think an easy way to start, is not by coming up with big plans and you need big budgets for it, but really just challenge yourself and perhaps your team to see if you can spend 5 minutes every morning doing some gratitude journaling, or do it in the evening. And just even if it's 3 minutes, to start and think about 3 things that you're grateful today. I do that. We have a 6-year-old daughter, and I do it every evening with her. And in the beginning, she hated that question. What are you grateful for? So I reformulated, and I was like, what were great things that happened to you? Or what, were the things you're happy about today? But now, oftentimes, she even comes to me and talks about this before bedtime. And I think it's really important and why that relates to inner development. I mean, there's a lot of research out there that shows that for every kind of bad interaction you have with someone, like you criticize them or so, you need 4 to 5 positive interactions to get back to 0.
Wow.
And that's also true for ourselves, for our self-talk. That, that conversation that we keep having in our heads with ourselves. Like at least I do, I tend to have difficult and disparaging, comments. And I think we need to remember that we need 4 times as many positive comments, looking at the positive side of things and what we're grateful for in order to have a balance. And so it's as simple as that. And if you can find a way to build that into a practice that you can do regularly, it really, I think, develops who you are. And that can be the start. And I think that oftentimes we can get really distracted by, okay, we need to bring everyone in. And, the way to get someone to reject the idea of inner development is to force them into, like a training. I mean, I guess all of us have sat in some kind of session where we're kind of coming in like this,
Yes.
like because someone, like our boss, our friends, our partner, like forced us in, and, we really don't want to be there. And so I think for me, the invitation is really just like find whatever practice that you find meaningful and just allow yourself some space and time for that. Because I think most people, many people that I speak to, they have a sense of what would they do if they had those 5 extra minutes, but they often don't allow themselves to take that time. And they think it's unproductive, or they think that what is my boss going to think if I sit at my desk 5 minutes in the morning, and just write on a piece of paper. But I would encourage people to take those steps.
Do you have a good example from your work at IDGs with the company and how they went about it?
I mean, we have a few examples and everyone is a bit unique. So earlier I talked a little bit about how IKEA is working with the framework, and they're doing leadership training, I think, across the board that includes also that inner perspective. And what I think they're doing really well is that they're trying to make this an issue that you can talk about within the company. And for that, they're using the IDG framework as kind of almost a reporting back on what is the progress that you're making on your inner development. And so they don't put numbers on it and everything.
Yeah.
It's not like, okay, I'm at 93% humility, I need to get to 96. It's not quite like that, but it's a reflection tool. And what they really like about it is that it's third party, that it's not something that they can control, because that sends a different message to the employees there, especially the young employees who are a little bit more critical these days about these kinds of corporate initiatives. But we see it with another organization that is actually doing this with external facing stakeholders, where they're trying to build some capacity with them. And they are using that as one module to try to get people to think beyond just, their roles, their job descriptions, and what they can do in that, but really try to see how can we empower people to do more, but without telling them what to do. Because just like sitting in a class that, you don't want to be in, if someone tells you what to do, like eat less meat, fly less, I mean, that's probably a pretty sure way to get them not to do exactly that, because we're not kids anymore.
And I cannot stop putting the framework into the perspective of an event, and especially a networking event.
Yeah.
Do you think it relates? Having an event organization, encourage their staff to look at the inner development goals and then apply them and actually create better events, better networking opportunities for the delegates.
I don't have, like a fixed kind of solution, what does this really have to do? But I think there is something there about that human element and about taking it one step beyond this idea, I think, where sustainability a lot of times is today. First of all, we're thinking only about environmental sustainability, and in that, probably only about kind of the carbon footprint. And then we quickly get into these talks about like, okay, what's the catering like? What's this? And it feels oftentimes like we had this like beautiful list of how we used to work before sustainability. And now just someone's coming and crossing off these things and we're not allowed to do this anymore. And this is now bad. And, like, first of all, I think people feel like ashamed, or maybe not ashamed, but they feel kind of like bullied almost, into doing something that they might not even 100% agree on, that this is something that is needed. And so I think there's this, resistance, I think, or backlash in some ways. And I think it comes from this like very myopic way of looking at sustainability. And we're missing the point that it's actually an opportunity, really. That if we are now asked to build a different world and really reimagine that it will take a little bit of, pain, because we get used to things, as you've mentioned, and we, like to have that comfort and to do things as we did them the last week. But there's also that excitement of trying out new things, doing, going to a new country, experiencing a new place, having a new partner. I mean, like we have that very human need, I think, within us as well. And so I think if we can tap a bit more into that, I think there's, really a lot of potential here in this industry where, it is about the connection, the experiences, and what happens when you bring humans together.
Yeah. And earlier today, you did an exercise, which I had the pleasure to participate in, and it was very emotionally charging.
Mm.
And the room laughed it off nervously.
Yeah.
Because I think nobody gathered the strength to just really crack in front of their peers.
One person did.
Yeah?
In fact, actually, one of the younger people in the room, they were very emotional, and they went into that. But I think you're absolutely right. I see this quite often, that people are laughing it off, and that's a good thing.
Yeah. So the exercise that you did was to divide the room into two groups, people from nowadays, living in this day and age, and people from 200 years forward. And those two groups met 100 years apart. So those that are living now had to go forward 100 years, and those that are from the future had to go back 100 years and have a conversation. And you guided the conversation with certain questions that the future was asking the present.
Yeah.
And the questions were tough. They were not accusing. Some of the questions were the future generation asking the current generation, you saw what's happening. Why didn't you act on it? And
that's actually not the question.
The
question was not why didn't you act? The question was, how do you feel with that? And I think that channels a lot of like what also Michael was talking about, right? That, because and sorry, I just jumped in right there, but I'm like really purposefully not trying to establish any blame in there. This is not about like, but you lived in this times, you should act, you're one of the privileged people, and all of these things that we can quickly get into, I think, especially, in my activist circles.
Yeah.
But really to start the conversation with, how does that feel? How is that for you to be part of that? Is that, really true? And so that's how we start.
Yeah. And that's a good thing that you stopped me, because I think that's what stayed with me is the feeling of blame and shame of seeing it but not acting on it, because I was the one that had to answer to the future.
Yeah.
And it was very tough.
Yeah.
Also, it was very reflective, I think, for both sides, because while we took our roles very seriously of past and future, I think we all had this moment of reflection and really understanding where we are, and that there is hope and there are actions we can actually take.
Yeah.
They might not be easy actions, but there are actions that are available. What are some of the lessons you've learned from doing this exercise, the extended version, because I understand this was the short version?
I think people don't talk enough about what gives them hope and what gives them strength, because that's where the exercise goes. I mean, the first one, you're right. It's a difficult question because you're confronted with, like all the bad in the world. And, then you're asked, like, how does that make you feel? Like nobody comes out of it and says, rainbows and unicorns. So that's the tough one. But I think then the questioning goes into that as a present day, because obviously one of the premises that I set up the situation with is that these humans exist 200 years in the future. We have made and the exercise is from Joanna Macy and what she calls the great turning, that we have actually managed to shift something. So there is something like really hopeful in there. And then the question is about, how did you actually get this change started? And for me, I think this is a really powerful exercise also in imagination. In, starting to think about not just, like the concrete problems that we have, like the typical way that I think we think about complicated problems or challenges is, all right, what's the problem? I'll find a solution to it.
Yeah.
And when I talk about complexity and the complex issues and how actually sustainability seems to be more of a complex issue than just a complicated, then all of a sudden their process oftentimes looks a bit different. I mean, Otto Scharmer has this theory U that I think like really is a great way of visualizing how we need to kind of go deep first before we can emerge on the other side with kind of new insights and new things. And yeah, that's why I think that is one of the insights I come away from, that we don't have enough space for these kinds of conversations, because it often feels like we'd rather numb ourselves scrolling away than to have a difficult conversation, including a difficult conversation with ourselves. I've seen these statistics where, yeah, rather than, spending 5 minutes in silence on your own, like people would do all kinds of, like crazy stuff to avoid that, to being alone with their thoughts. Yet, I don't know, I still remember a time when I didn't have, like a phone all the time that could just distract me at every moment, at the bus stop, at, like wherever I was having breakfast. Like I would have these moments where I was, with my thoughts. And that wasn't always easy. And of course, back then, I also felt that need sometimes to be like distracted. And I would read, like the labels of some cereal boxes or things like that. I don't know if anyone does that these days anymore. But yeah, I think that there's really something about kind of those conversations and, this also ability to be with yourself that we don't get enough space for. And I don't know if you've noticed, but like one thing that I also did was I purposefully ended the session like 5 to 10 minutes early, because I wanted people not to rush to the next session. I wanted them to be able to, I don't know, have 5 minutes and go to the bathroom, or even if it's checking their email, but that they don't feel like, all right, last topic gone, I'm rushing into something else, but that they have a little bit of time to integrate what they just heard.
Yeah, and I think to emotionally process, I needed personally 5 minutes to just emotionally process everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Do you believe that we need a systemic change moving forward?
Absolutely. I think that if we're talking about any kind of change, I think we need to have that systemic lens. I mean, one of the easiest models that we have in systems thinking is this idea of the iceberg, right? That like what we see on top as like the symptoms is often there's like a huge part underneath the water that is causing that. And I think to kind of look at what is on the bottom of the iceberg, I think that will help us much more move forward than trying to, rearrange the top part of the iceberg.
And I believe your work with the IDGs can help us get to the root quicker.
Yeah, we hope to contribute, something to that level, to that conversation. I mean, yesterday, our executive director was actually in the US, in the White House, speaking to the federal chief sustainability officer of the US about, this kind of insight really being part of their sustainability strategy. And I mean, I was really happy to see that, but this is, I think, the potential that we have, that this conversation can be spread into the places that need to have them through something like the inner development goals that I think we're quite good at speaking a certain language that is easy, that is memorable. There's a certain brand aspect that I think we do really well, and that has gotten people interested in the things that we're talking about without making them scared. Because I think, let's face it, talking about inner development, there's a lot of woo-woo stuff out there, like I get, often the question, like, what meditation hand-holding circle are you going to offer this time, And that, fair enough. I mean, I think there's that out there as well. And I think people can react to, that's not my cup of tea. But what we're trying to do with the IDGs is saying, like, you don't need to buy into all of that. We are a science-based framework. We talk about methods that actually there is scientific research on it, that this has an effect on people and this works. And the thing is, oftentimes, for scientific insights to kind of transpire into the mainstream society, that can take 30, 40 years. And we feel like we don't really have that time. And so I think we're part of a larger, I think, movement that I see in the world, that more and more impact people are starting to talk about the inner. More and more inner people are also understanding that it doesn't help to just sit in my eco-village while the world burns and I need to get engaged. So I think that bridge is slowly building, and we're one part of that.
Yeah. And I believe events are the perfect vehicle to spread the message further. And wrapping the conversation up, was there anything we didn't mention and we should before we end?
I think the one thing that I would like to mention about the IDG framework, and I think one is when you hear inner development, people start to think quickly about themselves and inside. And we also include the inner within organizations. So we talk very quickly about culture. And I would even argue that there is no inner development without the other, that we only develop kind of in relationship to others. And so, I mean, you've seen the framework. I think there's a way to kind of maybe pigeonhole our work into the side of being and relating, but we also have collaborating and acting. And that's why I did that collaboration exercise as well, because I think that is something that is just like really important in a lot of the organizations that we're in. And we probably all of us feel like we're pretty good collaborators. I think even someone said it out loud in the room that, this industry is, like already good. And not a single person, like really got the exercise right in the beginning, like, and I didn't either the first time I did it, but yeah, I think there is still a lot to learn, not just like kind of individually, but I think most importantly, collectively in our institutions, in the places where we work, where we go to school, where we hang out after work. Because if this conversation stays, I think, sandwiched somewhere between dinner time and bedtime, we're not going to get that systemic change that we need. And so I think I've already mentioned that it is about getting into practice, right? It can be as easy as a 2 to 5 minute gratitude journaling in the morning. And so I think that, we really need to watch out not to say that I can't do this unless it's going to, like be perfect or whatever. Like we, at the Inner Development Goals team, we often call it's the perfect imperfection of the things that we're doing. And I think that for me, that is quite important because that perfectionism, that also comes from this mindset of we're trying to solve a technical thing, whereas we're advocating that sustainability is actually an adaptive challenge. And so we need incremental change. We need to try out things. We need to, adjust as we go along the way. And I think, that is something that probably feels maybe a bit natural to people working in events.
Yeah.
And like sometimes I think like, who am I to come here and, like talk to people around complexity? I think probably event people, they know exactly what complexity means, bringing together, more than
That's
3
true.
people at once, I think, and trying to direct them into any direction is itself a feat of complexity. And you guys do it, times 1,000.
And that's why they need help, because when they deal with such complex issues on a daily basis, adding something feels like a huge ask.
Yeah.
So that's why I like the fact that you mentioned that it can be something small. It doesn't have to be large. It doesn't have to be dressed in strategies and percentages and yet another goal to reach. It can be something small, targeted towards the individual, and that would slowly but surely make steps in the right direction and inspire change in the organization and for themselves.
Yeah, and sometimes it could even be subtracting. I also tend to go a little bit longer in my sessions, but it was really on purpose after I saw yesterday also a comment made by someone about how a lot of the sessions are running over. I really thought, all right, I will subtract. If someone wants to know the things that I left out, they'll ask.
Yeah.
Nobody did, but so that
but
worked
they can
out.
Read.
Yeah, that worked out, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And they can read more if they need. Like I'll also link your work in the show notes. So the website will be easily accessible and more information if needed. So there you go.
Wonderful.
Oh, thank you so much, Daniel, for the time and coming and joining us on the podcast. It was my pleasure.
Thank you, Maggie. It was nice to be here.
Likewise. Thanks. If you enjoyed this episode, do give us a 5-star review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. For more industry insights, visit pcma.org/convene. Until next time.